Hey, it's Craig Syracuse, and welcome to another episode of Walk in Faith, the show where we go beyond the image and we discover who our guests really are. You might know them from TV, the big screen, or even the world of sports, but do we really know who they are as a person? Do we know what motivates them? Do we know what inspires them? Well, that's what we're here to find out. Today I'm joined by Jefferson Bethke. Years ago, he made a viral video, and he has been using multimedia to help people to understand their faith ever since. He's also here to talk about his new book, To Hell with the Hustle. Stay tuned and walk with us. Jefferson Bethke, thank you so much for coming all the way to Brooklyn. I have to ask first question. Who made the coffee today?
I'm a big coffee guy. I don't know if you follow me on Instagram, but I just got this thing. This has nothing to do with the book, but I'm going to talk about it. It's called the Porigami. It's kind of a play on words with origami, and I made it because it's amazing. And it's basically this little thing. You put it together, and you can travel and make coffee. I'm a big coffee guy, and I travel with my own beans
Because in your
and
book,
everything.
yeah, you were talking about that. I had to laugh because I had the same problem. Like, I always make coffee for my wife.
Yes.
And I said, I'm going to figure out how she's going to make the
Yes,
coffee. So I made
exactly.
it weak. Every day I
Yes.
make it weak.
Yes.
So she wound up buying an espresso machine, which now it's like $2 a coffee. So now I make the coffee as strong as possible.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
now I'm back to doing it.
Exactly. No, that is a fun part in the book where I talk about that. And I love that part talking about too of like, yeah, little things we do every single day. And I make the joke about how I make coffee every morning for Alyssa is actually these little habits that kind of build up to give us this intimacy and this love that we're all looking for. So yeah, that was funny. I actually forgot about that story. So
Yeah,
thanks for
I
reminding
was
me.
there to tell the story.
Yeah.
No, but like every time I get an interview or I meet somebody, I'm always like trying to figure out what's the purpose? What is this part of God's plan? Why are we meeting?
Yeah.
And I'm reading the book, and I mentioned off camera that it was exactly what I'm going through in my life.
That's
cool.
cool.
So I get books all the time. I have stacks of books.
Totally.
And I'm reading this book, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm on the plane going to Colorado last week, and I'm like, he's speaking to me directly.
Wow.
So before we get into the book, because I'm completely interested in the book, tell me a little bit about yourself in case our viewers aren't familiar with your story.
Yeah, so the best way I can kind of give context is probably 8 years ago, I made a viral video called Why I Hate Religion But Love Jesus. I think I was 22 at the time, wasn't doing it for any purpose. It was just for fun. I like to say I was a true millennial, so I made video like we breathe. You just kind of like you breathe and you make videos and you put stuff on the internet. That's what millennials do. I didn't think anyone would see it besides just maybe my mom and a couple friends, and a couple more people than that saw it, right? And what that did is that certainly, anyone who's gone through more viral experience turns your life upside down in a dramatic way, and then you kind of have to try to steward the experience of, man, what can we do with this in a way that's actually meaningful, not just like trying to take advantage of it, but actually doing stuff that I want to do and be hopefully what the Lord's called me to. And so then it kind of, over 8 years, that's turned into doing that full time, just trying to make videos, trying to make podcasts, trying to use the internet to encourage people, to equip people to think about Jesus in a deeper, fresher way, and specifically usually at the core of usually people that are my age and kind of my generation.
And you mentioned in the book too, you talk about the iPhone and how people think about the iPhone as a form of religion.
Yeah.
Because I was reading that, I'm like, but we need technology. Like, I think about technology or
Totally.
Instagram, let's say, as a form of communication. Right?
Yeah.
So the apostles used the current form of communication, which is storytelling. We use social media or whatever it is as just a form of communication. But you say, I guess people look at it as a religion.
Yeah, that was a fun part of the book. I probably can write that part better than I can say that part. I was kind of trying to draw this notion of just almost everything we do at some level is religious. It depends on how you mean that word, right? But everything we're doing has kind of meaning, or we're trying to form ourselves in a particular picture or take ourselves down a particular path. And I think that's kind of at some level what the big tent word of religion means. And so I just use this parallel in the book of like, we sometimes scoff, or maybe we think it's weird to think about some more Eastern traditions, right? You can take the Islamic tradition, the Jewish tradition, of more traditions that are kind of having more ritualistic prayer times, right? So you can go 3 times a day, if you're a true Orthodox Jew. I'm not exactly sure how many times certain Islamic traditions pray, but there's a call to prayer, there's a bell, they're getting down at certain times. I kind of talk about that. And then I just say, at some level, we're all doing that with our phones, right? We might think that's weird, but like we are doing deep ritualistic behaviors, right? Like when you're on your phone scrolling, you're doing like very kind of systematic behaviors, right? Swipe, 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 move over, go to the next one. It's solemn, it's somber, your head's down, right? You're kind of having a kind of a sacred time where you're trying to block out everything around you. And then specifically, like you want to see a call to prayer or like a bell, that's your ringtone on your phone, where, right, it's that little ding, and all of a sudden we kind of like react in a certain way, right? In the same way that people might react to the call to prayer bell in other traditions. I don't push that all the way down the line. I just say like, that's something to think about though, right? Like in the West, we might think because we're more secular, that we are more in control or we're not living in these ways, but we all are, right? We just are replacing it with different things. Now, you're right, though. Technology is good. Technology is a blessing. Technology has brought immense revolution, renovation, and good to the world, but we have to just ask, is there ramifications also, and are we reckoning with that? I think a lot of us just have our eyes closed to the ramifications, and so that's kind of that whole premise in that section.
What do you think some of the ramifications will be in a few years from now from the use of, say, the obsessive use of social media or, really you're married to your phone?
Well, there's a big idea in the book where I talk about we are what we worship, and we're formed into particular images. Like, here's another way to put it. You are who you are today because of the micro habits you did the last 5 years, right? Not some huge goals you had, not some huge things, but the things you almost were doing in an invisible, habitual way without even realizing it, that made you who you are today. And I think our phones are doing that to us, meaning like the habits we have with our phones, the habits we have with technology are forming us into people I think we don't want to be, right? Or we are what we worship in some sense, which means, like phones are deeply fragmented, quick, like measured in microseconds. They're bouncy, they're ADHD, they're all over the place, right? I think, well, like, that's us now.
Yeah.
Right? Because we're becoming what we worship. We're worshiping these devices that are created in these type of ways, and now our very image in us that's supposed to reflect God is now reflecting this. And so that's, I think, probably the largest ramification, is that we're becoming the images of the very things that we're giving our attention and our allegiance and our behavior to.
That's interesting, that perspective. And you mentioned about, in the book especially, you say about if we were to look at ourselves 2 years ago, like would we be happy with who we are today? I mean, that was a great question, because it's a direct question. Like my favorite question is, who am I? When you ask yourself that question, it's very hard to answer that question. So are you happy with, who you are today from 2 years ago?
Yeah, there's so many different layers there, and I think it depends. I think there's a fun layer there, right? Like when I read journals I wrote like 5 years ago, you're like, oh, who was I? What was I thinking? You know what I mean? And so part of that is kind of funny, because then you realize, like, why do you think it'll be any different 5 years from now about you today? You'll look back 5 years from now and be like, what was I thinking, or who was I, right? Usually more immature or weird or just kind of funny, But I actually think that's the good part of growth. You should be feeling that way, or else you're not growing. You know what I mean? So I think there's that part of it, which is kind of funny and unique. I think a better way to put it is trajectory, right? So in the real way, in the way that I think Jesus cares about, is when you look at yourself today, no one's perfect. We're not meant to be perfect. Jesus is perfect and takes us into that trajectory of becoming more like him. But can we honestly say that we were faithful, right? That the last couple of years we felt like we were on the path or the trajectory that he was calling us to? Because a lot of us aren't. A lot of us, we're on a trajectory of something more, again, that's non-faithful, that's more about results, that's more about than the process, that's more about what we're trying to accomplish or achieve. And so I just think those questions are really helpful. And faithfulness is a big one.
I know, and you said that's going to be eliminated from the dictionary in a few years.
You got through the whole book. That's the last chapter where I talk about that.
I read everything. We're going to take a quick break. You said an important word there, faith, but mostly you said faithfulness. We're going to be right back with Jefferson Bethke on Walk in Faith. So we're back with Jefferson. So you said a word, you said faith, right? And that's something that I think about all the time, right? I mean, the name of the show is Walk in Faith, but we have conversations with people. I had one the other day, actually, and I asked her and I asked myself, do I truly trust in God? Because it's easy to say I have faith, but do we truly trust in God? Like, especially for myself, I'm always like, I want to take the leap of faith. I want to take, I want to see what God has in store for me. But then I'm afraid, right? We have this fear, this anxiety. How do we overcome that? And how do we define, or how do we know if we truly have faith? Like, how do we develop that faith in God and that trust?
That's a good question. And I think you just alluded to it. I like the word better, trust. I like that word better. I mean, faith is obviously an iconic word, but I think trust gets to kind of the center of what I think faith is trying to say, or that we've kind of lost because it's such a big word in our culture with so much kind of meaning or buzz, right? And And I think it's trust, right? When you trust the floor to hold you when you step on it, right? Hopefully, unless it's maybe some really old floor, right? Or it's a gorgeous floor like this in this amazing church. You would say like, yes, I trust it. Or, I remember being at some, skyscraper along, I think it was in Chicago, and they have that thing where you can walk out on the glass, right?
Yeah.
I trusted that, so then I stepped out in that. And I think that's just a very clear picture of the Lord is calling us to trust him and to step into faith and into that trust with our own bodies, with our own embodiment action. But I want to encourage people too and say it's one step at a time. I think sometimes we think we have to go from A to Z, right? We just have to jump or whatever, but it's like it's one step at a time. And I think of the story of, Exodus and the story of Israel coming out of Egypt. The story I love, and I never hear people really talk about this part of it, is when God splits the seas. I don't even know if this will make sense, but I love this story because this is how I'm always thinking about it. When he split the seas, we just kind of usually have this thing in our mind of like, oh, he split the seas, that's victory moment, they just walk through. Do you realize probably how insane it was to walk in there? Like you got at least 70, 80, 100 foot walls of water. Like I don't think you're going in there like still cheering, You're probably like, this could fall on me at any minute and I will die. That's what I would feel. And the one step at a time thing, where like every step you take into the sea is more and more faith because you can't just kind of run out. Does that make sense? The more you're in the middle, the less you can actually escape. So if you're only one step into the Red Sea with the walls split, you can be like, oh, I have faith, but if they start crashing, I'll just kind of hop right back here.
That's a great point.
Right? You can't do that in the middle. But you only get to the middle, how? One step at a time. That's how God works. He relationally, one step at a time, you give him that faith, you trust in him, you lean in him, he will protect you and guide you, he will keep giving you that provision and keep giving you that road to walk on. But we also have to realize that it takes a lot of faith. It takes trust to actually put one foot in front of the other.
I never thought of it that way, especially that story. And what's interesting too is that, we have faith, right? But then we have society.
Yeah.
Right? So I can't figure this out. Everything has to be on paper, right? We have to figure everything out before we're willing to take another step, right?
Yeah.
We need that transition.
Yes.
But with faith, it's not like that, right?
Yeah.
It's just, I fully trust in God. He brought me this far. He's not going to leave me behind. And it's just putting everything on God. And that's difficult because social media, friends, peers, everyone's going to say, no, it's so difficult. And what I loved about the book is we spoke off camera is that motivational speakers are everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, I could become one. We can all become one. I mean, I could just recite, what Tony Robbins and everyone else said, which I do like Tony Robbins.
Yep.
But your book is the opposite, right? Because society says if you work hard, if you hustle, that's the word of the century now, you're going to make it, you're going to be successful. Yeah. But then, first of all, we don't know what success is, right?
Totally.
We have the secular success and then the spiritual success.
Yeah.
So we're all confused, right?
Yeah.
Don't trade time for money.
Yeah.
And this book is the complete opposite.
Yeah.
So if you could explain a little bit about why you wrote the book, what it means, and what the negative side of hustling is, and what that leads to in terms of your family life and your personal life.
This is a strong thought, but this is the entire chapter 6 of the book, but I really do mean it, and it takes a minute to unpack, so stick with me. And that's the fact that Jesus, if you really think about it, Jesus was a waste of talent. Jesus was a waste of talent, right? Now, he was a waste of potential. He was a waste of a lot of things by worldly standards, by worldly success. Now, why? Because first of all, this is God himself, who steps on the scene, and we hear nothing about him for 30 years. To me, according to worldly standards, we would say that's a waste. You just squandered all this power. You squandered all this ability. You had all this healing, and he could have done so much more. But obviously, it's not a waste of talent. Obviously, it's actually how Jesus and the kingdom operates that our world doesn't understand, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the juxtaposition is that we're always trying to get ROI. We're trying to get a return on investment. We're trying to be efficient. Efficiency is a god in our culture, right? If only we can do things that just always give us the most feedback, the most blessing, the most money, the most this, then we're successful. And Jesus says, no, sometimes wastefulness is success. You see Jesus also honor that in the stories he tells. You see Mary, goes and wastes a year's worth of wages of perfume on his feet. Everyone else says she's an idiot, that's stupid. And he actually says, no, her name will be known forever now because that's an act of love. Love is wasteful, right? You're never trying to be efficient with love. You're trying to go above and beyond. You're trying to be extravagant. You're trying to pour it on. And Jesus himself, as the embodiment of love, was deeply wasteful, so much to the point where he wasted himself on the cross. I know it's a weird way to think about it, but he goes all the way to the cross and then he expends himself, is maybe another way to put it, right? And he pours himself out on the cross. I could unpack that idea for an hour, so I'm just going to let that be, but I do think that's something we have to start thinking about is, man, our ideas of efficiency and all these different things are very polar opposite and competing with the ideas of the kingdom, which are love and intimacy based. And sometimes that looks wasteful to the world, even though it's right to God.
I agree. And like you mentioned, we spoke about success. Like in worldly standards, success is money, fame,
Yeah.
jewelry, whatever social media says is prevalent or popular, but that's not success, right? How would you define success in a spiritual sense?
I think faithfulness. I think that when I mentioned that earlier, I think success is faithfulness. And what I mean by that is you're faithful. Faithful means you're obedient, you're honoring, you're living in God's design, right? Not based on results, but based on the process of intimacy and relationship. Trying to be in relationship with his people. Relationships are not about results. Relationships are about the intimacy of the process, right? And so faithfulness then would be the marker of that, not a result or a bank account or something like that. Results follow. You'll get results, hopefully, sometimes, and there will be fruit, is what we call it. But I think faithfulness is actually God's idea of success. And you see that, by the way, in every single character, every big story in the scripture, that God honors the faithfulness of that person, right? Not what they achieved.
You're right. I mean, I look at that too as you know, God's my heavenly Father. Like, I have a son, we have kids, and I would still love him no matter what he did. Right?
Yeah.
As long as he is, you know, has certain attributes or aspects of his life, but I would always love him, whether he worked for the church or didn't work for the church.
Totally.
And interesting too about like hustle, like, and we have families, and in your book you spoke about what happens when you constantly hustle.
Yeah.
Like, and I thought about it, I told my wife the other day, I said, you know, I travel all the time, I'm never home, right?
Yeah.
And I say to myself, it's a sacrifice, but it's really not a sacrifice on my end. She's sacrificing.
Yeah.
She's the one that's home alone with my son. My son is sacrificing me not being there.
Yeah.
And you talk about that a lot in the book. And like, what is the negative side of hustling? What happens to you as a spiritual person?
Yeah.
What happens when you constantly hustle and work for, you know, a different purpose?
Well, I'll go back to the earlier idea of, you know, we are formed into images of whatever we worship or put our behavior on the trajectory of. And Jesus himself was a non-anxious presence who lived in the will of the Father in a perfect way, right? And we're called to reflect the image of him. So if we live in his design, non-anxious, non-hurried, non-hustled, then we'll become more like him. Another way to put it is you'll become less and less like him. Or another way to put it is you'll become less and less human. I know it's a weird way to think about it, but to be human means to reflect the image of God, right? That's what it really means. And so if you're not reflecting the image of God, you're dehumanizing yourself, right? I heard C.S. Lewis, says that hell is basically at some level going to be kind of just these animalistic creatures because the image of God has been ripped out of you. And by choice, by the way. It's them saying, like, I don't want to live in God's design, and hell at some level is God saying that's the logical conclusion of that then, right? Not saying that like I'm sending you there, but the logical conclusion of is just dehumanization. Fascinating picture if you think about it. And so then obviously the opposite of that, living in God's design, is more and more humanization. Becoming more and more human or truly robust and full and in the richness of how you're designed and created. And so that's what I would say are the trajectories we have to reckon with.
But in society, the further we get away from God, the more we're accepted. So it's like, I guess the millennials, no offense, right? Or whatever demographic, they're sort of drawn to that lifestyle because they'll be accepted, in the eyes of society, but not within the eyes of the church.
I think it's a little bit more of a Venn diagram than just sometimes, the world accepts you or the church accepts you. Another way to put it is, don't want to get political at some huge level, but I do actually enjoy talking about politics, and I think God actually cares about the city and cares about structures and systems and governments. But politics that's the good metaphor and example to talk about everything we're talking about. And then, as followers of Jesus, we're not slaves to political systems, but we're bondservants, which kind of means a willing slave, right, at some level, to Jesus as king, right? And another way you can say that is like we're not a slave to the elephant or the donkey, we're a slave to the lamb, right? And what I mean by that, and why I was saying there with the overlap thing is, sometimes, like we're called to just be faithful to Jesus. Sometimes that might accidentally line up with this system, and sometimes our obedience might accidentally line up with this system, right? And I think that's kind of even true sometimes. But the goal is not to be accepted by culture. The goal is not to be accepted by the world. The goal is to be faithful to Jesus. And maybe sometimes some behaviors we take might be accepted and they might not, but we kind of just take that on as almost collateral damage or fruit, however you want to put that, of just being faithful to Jesus.
That's great. I got a few more questions. We're going to take a quick break. Be right back with Jefferson Bethke on Walk in Faith. So Jefferson, just a few more questions. I know you have a busy schedule. And
Let's keep talking.
You live in Hawaii, right? Which is,
yes.
I think everybody here and all our viewers are jealous. I know I'm jealous. Never been to Hawaii.
It's the best.
But you spoke about something, like I said, there was a lot of things that, I don't know why I was drawn to those words. Like rhythm was a word that I've been hearing a lot.
Yeah.
And Mark Steele and I, we love the same preachers and motivational speakers. And there's that word rhythm we see and hear all the time. Can you explain by using the word rhythm in that sense?
Yeah, well, I just think I almost call it one of those secrets hidden in plain sight, right? And I think the Jewish tradition, which obviously our scriptures come from, the first half and Genesis and some of these things, hidden in plain sight is this idea that God clearly cares about rhythm. And what I mean by that is just like exactly the word means with music, right? That like it's a beat or a cadence that something's coming back to again and again and again to kind of set a tone for something to move forward. And I think God clearly believes for our lives should be in rhythm. And so the way I talk about in the book, I think is kind of like daily, weekly, and yearly, or daily, weekly, and seasonally, depending on how you want to think about it. But you see that in Genesis, right? Where God always is kind of saying like, day and night, day and night, day and night. Then he's saying, I finished all the work and now it's going to be a set apart day called the Sabbath. Or then Leviticus 23 goes through all the biblical holidays and says, because this season, because it's a harvest, because it's this, you should do this. So he's kind of asking us and calling us to submit and live into the design of the actual astronomical rhythm. But I think that's a picture also of how we should live just in our lives and our relationships, because it's living in God's kind of music, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of us are trying to buck up against that music. It's kind of like that guy at the wedding that you're like, dude, what are you doing? You know what I mean? Like, he's trying to dance, but he's not really dancing.
That might be me sometimes.
Yeah. But it's like usually when dancing looks really bad is when they're not dancing in rhythm, right? Mm-hmm. Now, you can have your own creativity and spin on dance moves. We're not robots. We're not called to do the exact same dance moves, but to dance properly, you have to dance in rhythm, in cadence, in this music. And I think that can be things like a work-rest rhythm. I think that can even be the way we do meals. I think that can be the way we sleep. When you're not living in rhythm, you're subtly saying, I am limitless. Mm-hmm. And that's subtly saying I am God, right? That I have no limits, that I don't need to be hindered, that I don't want to be put in a box. And that's like the Western ideal. We're all subtly saying we're gods, right? I don't need to sleep. I don't need to do this. I'll do it when I die. Edison himself, like when you dig into the etymology or research, whatever you want to call it, about the invention of the light bulb, Edison despised sleep, and the light bulb was actually a product of him trying to beat it.
Unbelievable.
Right? Like, it's not just a random guy inventing some random thing for the light bulb. He hated sleep, was said for 15 years to work about 20 hours and sleep 4 hours. And he even joked that he was almost, he was 50, I think, at the time, and he said, by working hours, I'm like 89 years old now, because if it was a normal 8-hour day, I would be, this old. And so, I just think that's the first thing is, by the way, that we bear things and we produce things into the world actually out of our beliefs. And then, something like the light bulb, like there's actual science and data and research, medical journals all throughout that completely support the idea that we are destroying ourselves because of our lack of circadian rhythm and because of artificial light, right? Like, that's clear. So stuff like that is just kind of an example of how that goes on and on.
You travel a lot. So how do you stay within the rhythm if you're traveling or if you have a busy life? Because I notice in myself, when I'm out of my routine or my rhythm,
totally,
it affects not only me, but it affects my family.
Yeah. I think there's a line, right? And we've tried to find this with our family where we're very much, because I think there's a difference between rhythm and rigid. There's a difference. Rigid is like stiff, right? It's non-human. It's, again, and so there's a line there that usually has to be spirit-led, and you kind of have to find it in wisdom, where you're actually breaking your rhythm a little bit, which is actually really exciting and really life-giving. But if you break it too much, then it starts to deteriorate yourself because you don't have the anchor of rhythm, right? So in other words, so like a Sabbath would be a good example. So me and our family take a pretty hard Sabbath. We've been practicing Sabbath for, 4 or 5 years. We do a pretty fun meal on Friday nights. It's celebratory. We sing songs. We light candles. It's special. We get out the nice tablecloth. And then Saturday, we usually just do like a family activity. So it's kind of like a mini holiday every week, right? Now, obviously, I'm traveling right now to the book tour. I'm away from the family. So we didn't do it Friday to Saturday night. Now, if I did that probably more than 6 weekends a year, that'd feel like it was breaking it up to the point of actually hurting us, right? About that many is like, it's fine. We know that there's work you're called to. And at some level, it's kind of just a fun adventure. You can kind of like play it up with our kids, like daddy, they're praying for me. They know daddy's on mission and going to work. So there's kind of just these lines that make sense where like you can be doing the same things, but it's kind of like working out, right? Like if you're working out 80% of the week, not every single day, you'll still be pretty ripped in a couple of years, right? And so that's kind of that idea of like, as long as there's a substantial amount, then that's what's giving you and creating your identity.
Interesting. So just a few more questions before we go. So what are some of the practical things that people can do, to sort of focus on what's important in life, to not focus on what society says is important, and to not worry about the hustle so much, and to just, be in line with Christ?
First of all, that's my favorite question, because I get asked that question a lot because I'm not very practical. So I'm always just like up here talking about this. And I do talk about this in the book. Each chapter is trying to be really practical in that there's spiritual practices and disciplines. This is the core of the book. If you take all the fluff out of it, there's spiritual disciplines and spiritual practices that have long-standing traditions, by the way, in the church that we've kind of lost because we're in the West, because we're in modernity, because we just don't care about them, because they maybe take a little more effort, that I just argue recovering them in a really robust kind of daily, small way. You don't have to do it huge, but again, if you're working out 5 minutes every day, your heart rate's going up and it's working, right? That will actually start to transform your life. Just start small, right? But start to implement maybe practices that you can say, oh, this is going to put me in this direction. So for example, to be really practical, one I just mentioned, if you feel like you are always on the edge of burnout, if you feel like you're always on the edge of like workaholicness, and you feel like you're kind of always fried and anxious, well, then there probably should be a practice somewhere in your day and in your week of just resting, of turning your phone off, turning your email off, having a nice meal with your family, or if you're in a college, your dorm mates or whatever it is, young professional with your friends, making that a practice and then cultivating it, practicing it. I think too, by the way, we put so much pressure on spiritual practices of like they have to be perfect and God has to show up. They're called spiritual practices for a reason, just like practice. Just do it over and over and over and over again. And maybe in 10 years, it might have done something, And so I would say that's a place to start, That one, I talk about cultivating silence in the book, only a couple minutes a day. And then maybe if you want to cultivate more time than that, but 2 minutes a day, and then you can move to 5, then you can move to 20. So those are some things I would say for practical.
This has been great. I really appreciate you coming all the way here to Brooklyn.
Yeah, it's far.
So now we can find the book on Amazon. Can you mention a few of the websites?
So the ebook available anywhere ebooks are sold, audiobook anywhere audiobooks are sold. The audiobook was fun. I put some extra little nuggets in there that aren't in the book. I read it myself. It's not some random British guy or some computer voice or something. If it was a British guy, that'd be kind of cool though.
Yeah, that would be.
Because that's like everything sounds better.
You want a Brooklyn accent
That
guy?
would be sweet.
I could totally do it.
That'd be sweet. And then then obviously anywhere books are sold, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, all that stuff.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate Jefferson Bethke. Please be on the lookout for his new book. Pick it up. I really enjoyed it. Always remember, guys, you have the ability to inspire and evangelize through your words and actions. Until next time.